Chapter 365, Sword 4. Drip. The face of O Qianmu, master of the spiritual sword sanctuary, was instantly covered in cold sweat. His eyes wouldn't leave the single character for sword that Mok Jiangun had engraved, though it appeared he was just staring on the surface. Clang clang clang. He had already fallen into a mental state where he was competing against the sword intent contained in the sword character. No, the expression competing wasn't accurate. Overwhelmed by the sword intent, despite having achieved the way of the sword, extreme of the sword, he was struggling just to defend against it. How could this be? Though it was just a single character, this sword intent contained immeasurable power. To handle that power, he tried to unleash all the sword techniques containing his enlightenment, but he couldn't approach it in any way. There are no openings. He employed all the sword techniques he knew to find a weakness, but he couldn't compare to this sword. This was truly the sword close to the extreme that he had been longing for. How could such a thing happen? It made his generations of crafting and training with swords seem futile. He wasn't the only one who had fallen into shock. More than half of those present had fallen into a mental state upon seeing the sword Mok Jiangun had engraved, and they couldn't come to their senses, gripped by trembling. This was especially true for those who had dedicated everything to the sword. The same was true for Zhang Myong Sate of the Hangshan sect. How could this be? She was quite intelligent, enough to gain enlightenment just from seeing the way of the sword, extreme of the sword. But this was on a completely different level. If Master O's way of the sword, extreme of the sword, was like seeing the soliloquy of a lofty blade user who had climbed to the peak of a mountain, this sword was on an entirely different track. Rather, it showed the ultimate through the sharpness of the sword itself. It was truly arrogant, no, boundlessly presumptuous. It was as if it was saying that under heaven only this was a sword. It's a sword that subjugates everything. This was the honest feeling she had. Any sword disciple would inevitably fall into shock, trembling, and a sense of defeat. Clang. Eventually, even the sword she was holding fell. The sword valley was died in silence, as if everything had stopped. The only sounds that could be heard were the helpless dropping of swords here and there. Clang. Clang. Watching this, O Yianwo, who was prostrated, couldn't hide his inner excitement. Is this the one the order has been waiting for? Although he had directly seen Mok Jiangun's strength, he had inwardly expected that he wouldn't match his father, who could be called the pinnacle of the current martial world, one of the 6 heavens. Yet here were his father, Master O Qianmu, and these many sword disciples, unable to hide their shock at the sword character engraved on the cliff. The reactions around were the same. Just looking at this, the winner of this sword discussion had been decided. O Yianwo's eyes reddened. He had been afraid of losing his love, Yi Song. But with this, neither his father O Qianmu nor anyone else here would hold her responsible, so it seemed he could rest easy. Thud. Feeling so grateful, O Yianwo bowed deeply to Mok Jiangun, hitting his forehead hard on the ground. He was truly a savior. But then, hook. At that moment, someone's shout was heard from somewhere. Looking in that direction, they saw O Wongsong, the second son of Master O, holding onto the ground with one hand near the cave leading out of the sword valley. When had he gone there when he had been nearby until just now? As they were wondering, where are you going? Why you? Come here. Grab. Mok Jiangun, who was walking on air down towards the cliff, made a gesture of pulling him with his hand. Then O Wongsong, who had been holding onto the ground with his left hand, was forcibly pulled. Aya. Scrape, 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 scrape. He struggled so hard that his fingernail marks were left on the ground. Eventually, even his fingernails were torn off, leaving blood marks. Young Master O. Catch the young master. Hearing his screams, some of the spiritual sword sanctuary's sword disciples who had shallow mental states due to lack of enlightenment were startled and tried to stop this. However, thud. As Mok Jiangun lightly raised his hand upward, thwack. The body of the second son O Wongsong, which had been dragged along the ground, floated up, flew past them to near Mok Jiangun, and was thrown down onto the ground. Damn it! O Wongsong, sprawled on the ground, didn't know what to do. Seeing his father, Master O Qianmu, and most of the sword disciples unable to hide their amazement and shock, he thought everything had gone wrong and believed he needed to escape this place somehow. But to be caught like this before he could even run away. Feeling dismayed, Oh Woong-sung seemed to think better of it and shouted. What are you doing? The master took a step back and agreed to end this by discussing swords. So why are you committing such violence? Violence? What an interesting thing to say. At that moment, the sword disciples of the spiritual sword sanctuary hurriedly ran over to try to protect Oh Woong-sung. Don't touch young Master Oh. Protect young Master Oh. Just as they were about to get close to the second son Oh Woong-sung. Mok Jae-eun drew a line of sword intent in front of them. A line made of sword energy was created on the ground, and they had no choice but to stop momentarily. Mok Jae-eun warned them in a dry voice. I advise you not to cross that line. Though there wasn't particularly any killing intent in it, the pressure made the sword disciples unable to easily cross the line with stiffened faces. However, just because they couldn't cross the line didn't mean their mouths were frozen too. Is this how you repay the kindness shown by the master? Do you really want to go against our sect? Mok Jae-eun ignored their protests. Instead, he approached the second son Oh Woong-sung and said, not content with coveting something that wasn't yours, you've been quite troublesome. What are you talking about? I didn't covet anything, I was just trying to protect against the dangerous fire faith order. Before he could finish speaking, thud. Something fell to the ground, flapping. At that moment, a scream of pain burst from Oh Woong-sung's mouth. Arg. This was because his one remaining left arm had been cut off. He had just stopped the bleeding on his right arm, but now with his left arm cut off too, his face instantly turned pale due to the blood gushing out like a fountain. Why you madman? Young Master. Seeing the second son Oh Woong-sung rolling on the ground, staining it with blood, the sword disciples shouted and tried to cross the line. Right at that moment, rumble rumble, whoosh. On the cliff ground lay the swords of the sword disciples who had died because of the blade user. Suddenly, these masterless swords all rose up at once and flew like living things to block the path of the sword disciples. Their expressions hardened at the 8 or so swords blocking their way. This sword control with energy. It was the marvel of sword control with energy. With not just 1 but 8 swords blocking their way, they were momentarily at a loss, caught off guard by the pressure of this amazing sight. They had occasionally seen Master Oh Kyeonmu, one of the 6 heavens, demonstrate sword control with energy. But even then it was just 1 sword or at most 2 or 3. Yet seeing 8 swords being controlled simultaneously before their eyes, they even began to doubt. This can't be. No matter what, he can't be stronger than the master, right? Is it just a bluff? No, for a bluff this is. The movement of the swords was not ordinary. Each sword felt as if it were truly alive. If he could really control this many swords not just with simple air grasping but with the marvel of sword control with energy, he would be nothing short of a monster beyond imagination. As they were suppressed by these controlled swords, unable to move, Mok Jae-eun approached the second son Oh Woong-sung rolling on the ground and continued speaking. It's not over yet. What are you going to do to me? That tongue. Swish. Mok Jae-eun reached out his hand. Then, Uerg. Hack. The second son Oh Woong-sung's mouth was forcibly opened and his tongue stuck out. The eyes of Oh Woong-sung, who was even shedding tears from the pain of his severed arms, shook wildly. No matter how you looked at it, this monster-like guy's goal was clear. It was his tongue. Oh, fliha. Unable to pronounce properly because his tongue was caught, he made unintelligible sounds. It looked like he was pleading to anyone who saw. At that moment someone hurriedly ran over and knelt on the ground. They were none other than Oh Yeon-woo and Junior Master Oh Woong-hwang. Master of the Holy Fire, please stop. Sir. I will apologize, so please show mercy to my brother. As if they had coordinated beforehand, they tried to protect the second son Oh Woong-sung. Seeing this, Mok Jae-eun smiled slightly and said, what close brothers you are. But that's that, and consequences are consequences. Swish. Ok. As Mok Jae-eun moved his hand slightly, the second son Oh Woong-sung's tongue began to twist and turn. It seemed he wasn't going to cut it off but twist and tear it out. At this, Oh Yeon-woo desperately shouted, hitting his head on the ground. Please. Please. Save my brother. Who said anything about killing him? I'm just extracting the price for carelessly wagging that 3-inch tongue. Mok Jae-eun's attitude was utterly firm. But then someone's voice was heard. You shall stop. At that moment the surroundings stirred. The owner of the voice was none other than Master O Qianmu. He had somehow regained his senses after being immersed in a mental state, unable to take his eyes off the sword engraved on the wall. As Master O, one of the six heavens, was the only one in this place who could stop that monster-like person, everyone's eyes showed relief. As if responding to these expectations, O Qianmu approached where Mok Jiangun was and said, "Are you trying to pull out that child's tongue?" Rather than pulling out, tearing off would be a more fitting expression. Roar. No sooner had he finished speaking than Master O Qianmu's true energy burst out in all directions. Anyone could see he was enraged. Seeing him like this, all those around first felt relief, but then couldn't help feeling anxious inside. They had thought that with the master taking a step back, a fight wouldn't break out. But because of that person's actions, the atmosphere had changed. No matter how good-natured Master O was, from the standpoint of a parent with children, this wasn't a situation that could be tolerated. So it's come to this after all. The aftermath might be huge. Everyone watched tensely. But right at that moment, swish. Master O Qianmu's body trembled slightly, and then, suppressing his anger, he clasped his hands together and showed respect to Mok Jiangun. Everyone couldn't hide their bewilderment at this sight. Why on earth was he doing this? Then Master O spoke. "The child has already paid enough of a price with both arms cut off. If you take his tongue as well, his situation would be no different from death. Please, in your generosity, show mercy." Everyone was shocked. They had thought he would surely be unable to contain his anger and fight, but Master O suppressed this and stepped back once again. Was it parental love? Or patience to prevent greater sacrifices? Despite this, Mok Jiangun seemed not to care at all, smiling slightly and saying, "I apologize. It seems I've shown enough mercy by not killing him. And decisively, I don't possess a generous heart." Swish. With those words, Mok Jiangun slightly moved his finger. Then the second son O Wongsong's tongue, which was already half twisted, turned even more. Crunch. Arg. O Wongsong screamed and rolled on the ground in such pain. He was already deathly pale from excessive blood loss, and if the bleeding wasn't stopped quickly he might lose his life. Then, Xing. Master O Qianmu drew his sword from its scabbard. Would this finally lead to a fight? At that moment, something no one expected happened. Master O Qianmu grabbed his sword with the opposite hand and cut off his own right arm. Thud. His right arm fell helplessly to the ground. Everyone was too shocked to speak as they stared at it. For him, a craftsman and sword disciple, his right arm was as precious as a 1,000-year treasure. Yet he cut it off without a moment's hesitation. As everyone stood there with their mouths open, Master O Qianmu, gripping his bleeding wrist and enduring the pain, spoke. "Haha. A child's wrongdoing originates from the parents who taught them. Let this serve as the price instead." Chapter 366, Sword 5. Master O Qianmu's right arm, still twitching as if sensation remained, spurting blood. Crack, crack, crack. The ground where the right arm had fallen was split in several directions as if struck by a sharp sword. His right arm, which had reached the realm of oneness with the sword and the way of the sword, extreme of the sword through long years of training, was like a sword itself. This alone showed how high a realm he had reached in swordsmanship, but even more shocking was, a master. Why did he do it himself? He had cut off his own right arm, which could be called the treasure of a craftsman and sword disciple. At this sight, everyone was momentarily speechless. Why on earth did he make such a choice? He was the master of this sword valley, called the sacred place of swordsmanship, and the spiritual sword sanctuary, as well as one of the six heavens, the pinnacle of the current martial world. No matter how one thought about it, there was no reason for him to go this far. Even if that monster-like person's swordsmanship was beyond imagination, no one here thought Master O Qianmu would be inferior to him. Ugh. The eyes of the second son O Wongsong, whose tongue was caught by Mok Jiangun's true energy, shook wildly. He too was greatly shocked. He had thought his father would surely fight for honor and pride. Although he was a son, he wasn't particularly favored compared to his older brother, the junior master in martial arts, or his younger brother Yinhua in craftsmanship skills. Therefore he didn't have high expectations of his father. He thought it would be fortunate enough if he just wasn't left to die. But why? Why did he cut off his arm that he cherished so much? Is a painful finger still a finger? Enough to throw away his pride as a martial artist and his life as a craftsman? Although he was narrow-minded and wayward compared to his brothers at this moment, he couldn't help but feel complicated emotions welling up inside. Ugh. Seeing Oh Woong-sung shedding tears, people thought that Master Oh Kyun-moo was indeed a father. A father who could sacrifice anything for his son. However, they're mistaken. He who was watching this scene from afar snorted. Right now they thought Master Oh Kyun-moo had unhesitatingly sacrificed his precious arm to save his son. But from his perspective it wasn't like that at all. Humans tend to see only as much as they know. In this place, excluding Master Oh Kyun-moo, the only one who had reached the highest realm in both swordsmanship and martial arts, surpassing the wall, was himself. At most, Jong Myong-sate of the Hangshan sect might vaguely guess as she was approaching the wall, but that sword engraved on the wall was truly in a league of its own. He too had been momentarily gripped by a sense of defeat upon seeing the trace engraved on that cliff. This was incomparable to the shock of seeing the way of the sword, extreme of the sword. An unattainable, distant height. That's a real monster. A monster who had reached a realm that even Master Oh Kyun-moo couldn't attain. To be honest, if Oh Kyun-moo and that person were to fight, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say the outcome was somewhat predetermined. Unless some special variable occurred, Master Oh Kyun-moo's victory would be difficult. He knew this himself, which is why he cut off his own arm. Cunning old man. He had been here for a long time, so he knew well how cunning Oh Kyun-moo, a figure respected by the world, was. He was a man who, under the pretext of guiding later generations with his way of the sword, extreme of the sword, kept numerous swordsmen here and shared their insights to further develop himself. He never takes actions that result in a loss for himself. That's why even when crafting swords he received the recipient's unique sword techniques in return. Who else could make such a bold request? If we clash, he loses everything. That's why Oh Kyun-moo made the extreme choice of cutting off his own arm. In fact, those present still believed in Oh Kyun-moo, so they didn't realize, but he could see it. If he didn't show at least this much sincerity, who knows how the opponent might react. He's secured his justification. Given this, even that monster-like person would find it difficult to persist further. He had even cut off his right arm for his son, so going beyond this would be crossing the line. If there's a minimum level of propriety, he should stop here. Although Oh Kyun-moo had lost an arm, thanks to the public perception that he sacrificed for his son, he wouldn't lose his pride as a martial artist. But right at that moment, you've done something unnecessary. One's own mistake is simply one's own mistake. What are you? I clearly said it. You've done something unnecessary. Swish. Mok Jae-eun moved his hand. Then the second son Oh Woong-sung's tongue twisted and finally tore partially, causing blood to burst out. Splurt. It was on the verge of being completely torn off. At this sight, Oh Kyun-moo finally couldn't contain his anger and shouted, "How dare you? It's not how dare you. I never told the master to take responsibility as a parent. And one's own mistake should rightfully be one's own responsibility." What? At Mok Jae-eun's firm words, Master Oh Kyun-moo became not just angry but dumbfounded. As Joey had predicted, he had realized through the trace on the cliff that even if he competed with Mok Jae-eun, his chances of winning were low. Therefore he cut off his right arm, swallowing tears of blood, to gain the justification of sacrificing for his son. This is a fight that must be avoided. There was too much to lose, so he had to avoid fighting even in this way. Cutting off his right hand was a great sacrifice by anyone's standards. However, he had trained his left hand to some extent to pursue an even higher level of swordsmanship, so losing this wouldn't be the worst-case scenario. All of this had been somewhat calculated. But, is this person really? Even after showing such submission by cutting off his own right arm, he still insists on taking that child's tongue? It was truly bewildering. There was no longer any justification for endurance. Rather, if he didn't step forward in this situation, it wouldn't be his honor, but his face that would hit rock bottom. Grip. In an instant, Oh Kyun-moo's mind became complicated. If he fought to maintain face, defeat was inevitable. But if he didn't step forward here, he would be branded a coward who didn't lift a finger even as his son was being brutally treated. It was truly a dilemma. I was foolish. What he thought was an excellent move turned out to be a losing move. Normally, in such a situation one would stop out of propriety, but this person's actions were the opposite of expectations. Perhaps it would have been better to fight risking his life rather than cutting off his arm. It was then. Swish. At that moment, Mok Jae-eun, who had been making a gesture of twisting, stopped and said, "It seems I've become quite soft-hearted." A look of puzzlement flashed in Oh Kyun-moo's eyes. He thought he would have to fight after all, but suddenly stopping like this, what was his intention? Had he changed his mind after taking a hard line? But then, the master's filial heart for his child is so touching. If I were to tear out his son's tongue here as well, it wouldn't look very good, would it? Then are you also backing down? I suppose so. However, I don't particularly like leaving loose ends. Loose ends? Is he asking for a pledge not to seek revenge? If that's the case, he could certainly give it. He hadn't even thought about revenge in the first place. He had surpassed wall after wall and reached the way of the sword, extreme of the sword, over many years. But this person was clearly much younger than himself. How could he dream of catching up and seeking revenge in any lifetime? I have too much to lose. The more one has in hand, the more one thinks of consolidation rather than future troubles. To this, Oh Kyun-moo spoke in a cautious voice. It was an action to save my child. How can you blame this? If your anger has been appeased by this old man too wishes to make a clear end here. It's good that you're magnanimous. But I tend to be quite cautious. Oh Kyun-moo inwardly clicked his tongue. What a difficult person. How can someone who has reached such a high realm be so cautious? Or is he meticulous? To this, Oh Kyun-moo exhaled softly and said, "Then what do you want? If you want a promise, I can even leave it in writing." In writing. Not bad. But something written on paper can always be torn up. Then what on earth do you want? I have some sense of shame, so asking for your Danjian to be destroyed seems excessive. Since it's come to this, how about receiving your remaining arm as well? At that moment, Oh Kyun-moo's expression twisted terribly. He wondered what on earth he would demand, but he never imagined he would ask for his remaining arm as well. Murmur, murmur. The surroundings stirred. Has this person truly gone mad? Even though Master O had put aside his pride as one of the six heavens and made such concessions for his son, to ask him to cut off his remaining arm as well? He had truly crossed the line. At this, "Master, this is not right. We will help the master too. The second young master will understand the master's heart. You must not submit. You don't need to endure any longer." Cries of anger burst out from here and there. At their boiling cries, strength entered Master Oh Kyun-moo's hand, holding the sword in his left hand. Not content with cutting off his son's two arms, he asks for his remaining arm. He had certainly crossed the line properly. It seems many are angry. But you should listen to the end of what I was saying. To the end? Now that. If the master, with great spirit of sacrifice, cuts off his remaining left arm himself, I'll reattach one of your son's arms. What? At these words from Mok Jae-eun, everyone was dumbfounded. How could he reattach an arm that had already been cut off? To spout something that can't be done even if a god came down, is he taking the master and themselves for fools? Don't you believe me? Mok Jae-eun said with a slight smile. They shouted, "What nonsense are you talking, Master? This person is insulting you. There's no need to listen. Right now." But then, At that moment, one of the swords floating with the sword control with energy technique flew and cut off the arm of one of the spiritual sword sanctuary's sword disciples, who was shouting, "Ag!" Clang. At this sudden sword strike, everyone around drew their swords. Was he really going to do this? At that moment, whoosh, hook. As Mok Jae-eun opened his hand and pulled, the sword disciple whose arm had been cut off was forcibly flown to the front of Mok Jae-eun by his vast true energy. Although he was a first-class expert compared to Mok Jae-eun's realm, he was no better than a bug on the ground, so he couldn't withstand the true energy. Swish. Are you truly going to see this through to the end? Master Oh Kyun-moo aimed his sword held in his left hand at Mok Jae-eun. Mok Jae-eun shrugged and said, "Since you don't believe me, I'm just trying to show you." What do you? It was then. Float, float. The severed arm rose up and flew towards the sword disciple who was caught by the true energy. In that state, Mok Jae-eun lightly struck the acupoints on the severed part. Then, as if the bleeding had been stopped, the blood somewhat ceased. "It will hurt a bit. What are you doing? Thud. At that moment, the floating severed arm attached to the severed part of the sword disciple's arm. In that state, Mok Jae-eun held sword intent in his right hand and placed it on the severed part. Then with his left hand, tap, 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 Lim. 2. John. J. Jean. Gi. He formed the abbreviated hand seals of the 9-character resurrection technique. As he formed the hand seals, red heat flowed from the tip of the sword intent in Mok Jae-eun's right hand. The sword disciple was startled and didn't know what to do. However, his body was forcibly bound by the true energy, so he couldn't move at all. Then Mok Jae-eun moved the sword intent along the severed part. In that state, Eastern Blue Emperor Great General God, I invoke you. Central Yellow Emperor Great General God, I invoke you. Western White Emperor Great General God, I invoke you. Northern Black Emperor Great General God, I invoke you. Central Yellow Emperor Great General God, I invoke you. He chanted the incantation inwardly. Sizzle. Along with this, smoke rose from the severed part where the sword intent passed. The sword disciple screamed in pain that felt like burning. Arg. Seeing the sword disciple suffering like this, Master Oh Kyeonmu finally stepped forward. He was the only one who could face this person. Stop right now. Whoosh. Oh Kyeonmu, who had kicked off the ground, narrowed the distance in an instant and aimed for Mok Jae-eun's brow. Then Mok Jae-eun, as if using the sword disciple as a shield, put him in the path. Because of this, Oh Kyeonmu had to change the trajectory of his sword. Oh Kyeonmu, who had brilliantly changed direction with a variation technique, created sword shadows in more than 10 directions, forming a shape like fully bloomed flower buds closing in reverse. Everyone couldn't help but admire his splendid sword technique. It was so excellent that even the sword technique he displayed with his left hand, not his right, made people wonder why he had stepped back earlier. But then, thud. Mok Jae-eun thrust the sword disciple's head into the center of the trajectory of the closing flower buds. Oh Kyeonmu's eyes shook. Although he had diligently trained his left hand as well, with his skill he could precisely avoid this and aim for Mok Jae-eun. But if the trajectory deviated even a little, the sword disciple would die. Whoosh. Finally, Oh Kyeonmu gave up on unleashing his technique, created distance and shouted, "How can you be so cowardly?" Oh Kyeonmu's eyes widened as he shouted. This was because the sword disciple who had been suffering until just now had unknowingly moved his severed arm. The sword disciple who had unconsciously moved it now seemed to realize this, looking at his previously severed arm in surprise. The pain had disappeared and he could move his arm and fingers freely at will. The sword disciple's expression became one of disbelief. This is. The other sword disciples and guests around also had the same reaction. They had been wondering what on earth he was doing, but the sword disciple's severed arm had really been reattached. It was a sight unbelievable even after seeing it. While everyone was amazed, Mok Jae-eun said, "I told you, didn't I? That I could reattach a severed arm." Did it sound like empty words? This was a healing technique called the Three Marvels method. Although there were several tricky conditions, if these were met, it was a miraculous technique that could even reattach a severed arm. Among these conditions, the biggest restriction was that it required the subject's primal energy. In simple terms, it meant sacrificing part of one's lifespan. Naturally, the stronger the technique, the greater the restrictions had to be, but since it didn't consume one's own primal energy, it was a useful method. Now, what will you do? If you give your remaining arm, I'll reattach your son's arm. The choice is entirely up to you, Master. Master Oh Kyeonmu was speechless at Mok Jae-eun's proposal. As the greatest craftsman in the Central Plains and one of the Six Heavens, he could usually maintain the upper hand in any deal no matter who came. But not this time. He had never encountered someone so cunning. To say he would reattach his son's severed arm if he gave up his remaining arm? Hurry and choose. Will it be your son's arm or your own? Grip. Oh Kyeonmu bit his lip hard. He had never met someone so vicious. From the start there was no real choice in this proposal. He would lose everything no matter what he chose. If he cut off his arm, it would be as good as ending his life as a martial artist or craftsman, and if he didn't cut it off, it would be like abandoning his son and he would have to fight this person anyway. If that happened, he would lose everything all the same. Drip. A situation where he could choose nothing, caught between a rock and a hard place. The master's forehead was now drenched in sweat, and his head throbbed as if it would split. Murmur, murmur. He couldn't hear a thing as those around him clamored. Oh Qianmu's dazed gaze eventually turned to Mok Jiong'un. Shudder. Oh Qianmu's expression froze when he saw Mok Jiong'un's face. He was smiling as if all this was enjoyable, but that smile was full of malice. The bastard was testing him, no toying with him. Evil spirit. This person is truly like an evil spirit. Now he understood. From the beginning, the bastard was aware that he was trying to avoid fighting under the pretext of doing it for his son. That's why he induced this situation. A situation where no matter what he chose, it would be the worst outcome. Tremble. Realizing this, Oh Qianmu felt for the first time in his life, intense fear and terror towards another human being. It wasn't because he was a peerless sword master surpassing himself. This person, like an evil spirit, thoroughly manipulated and subjugated even the hearts of others. In the end, unable to choose anything, Oh Qianmu, thud, fell to his knees on the spot. Master! Father! Everyone cried out in surprise at this sight. But Oh Qianmu no longer heard anyone else's gaze or voice. Suffering as if his head would explode between two paths filled only with the worst outcomes, he finally let go of everything as if attaining enlightenment. Thud. Oh Qianmu then bowed his head to the ground before Mok Jiong'un and said, "This old man begs for forgiveness like this. I will do anything you want, so please show mercy." Chapter 367, Sword 6. This old man begs for forgiveness like this. I will do anything you want, so please show mercy. For a moment silence fell. Everyone looked at Master Oh Qianmu with shocked expressions. How could such a thing happen? Not only had he cut off his arm, but now he had even knelt down, he who was the master of the spiritual sword sanctuary, called the sacred place of swordsmanship and one of the six heavens, considered the pinnacle of the current martial world. This isn't right. Is it really because of the second young master? Isn't this tantamount to a declaration of defeat? Only now did the sword disciples of the spiritual sword sanctuary and the guests start to find this strange. No matter how precious a son might be, it was inconceivable for someone called the pinnacle of martial artists to so easily discard his dignity. Could it be that he judged there was nothing he could do no matter what he chose? As everyone was speechless with shock, it happened. Thud. At that moment the youngest, Oh Yanwo, hurriedly approached, prostrated himself and said, "Master of the Holy Fire, I too will beg like this. Please show mercy." Young master. The sword disciples of the spiritual sword sanctuary shouted in angry voices at Oh Yanwo's action. It was frustrating enough that the master was showing such a sight in front of the guests. But what was this? But it wasn't just him. Thud. Junior Master Oh Wung Huang also approached, knelt beside him and bowed his head. And in a solemn voice he said, "If it's difficult to quell your anger, I, as the master's successor, will offer my head in front of everyone. Please, in your mercy, end this here." What? Why is even the junior master doing this? Those watching couldn't hide their frustration. Why were Master Oh Qianmu, who was called close to the best in the world in discussing swords, and his family lowering themselves to this person, enduring such shame? They took pride as sword disciples and considered the master's sword to be the best under heaven, which is why they gathered here, calling this place the sacred ground of swordsmanship. For them, the sight of the one they respected subjecting himself to such humiliation was something they absolutely could not understand, no, could not accept. Clang. Thing. The guests too drew their swords. One by one they shouted, "Master! If you're doing this to prevent your son and those here from being sacrificed, stop now. We too are martial artists. We are prepared to die at any time. That's right. If the master leads, we will all follow. Don't show weakness to the enemy. That's right. Let us be the master's strength. Let's not just watch but help Master O and protect the Sword Valley with our own hands." Wah wah. The sword disciples and guests, who were not just angry but enraged, raised their morale and shouted. Seeing them like this, Moyong Hak, dispatched as an investigator from the Righteous Alliance, who was watching from a distance, couldn't contain his excitement and said, "Shouldn't we help too?" At his words, Zhang Myong Sate of the Hangshan sect spoke with a serious face. "It doesn't seem like a problem that can be solved by helping." "What do you mean?" Master O is being toyed with by that Fire Faith Order member with his son taken hostage. Are you saying we should just watch? Amit Ba. Patron Moyong, do you truly not understand why Master O is doing this? What? Master O isn't doing this because of his son and the guests. What do you mean? I hope this humble monk's judgment is wrong, but it seems Master O believes there's no hope even if he fights that person. At these words, Moyong Hak's eyes widened. What does this mean? Are you saying that Master O, one of the 6 Grand Masters called the pinnacle of the current martial world, bowed his head, sensing defeat even before fighting to an unheard-of newcomer? It was incomprehensible. Even if that person was strong, it was impossible for him to be overwhelmingly stronger than Master O, who had reached the extreme in swordsmanship. Then shouldn't he fight risking his life to protect his own honor? Even if the other was strong for an expert of Master O's level, shouldn't he fight risking his life to protect his own honor? Where has his pride as a martial artist gone? It seems some are feeling disappointed. He, who was watching the situation as if it were someone else's business with his hands behind his back, inwardly clicked his tongue. In the end, this happened. He had thought such a situation wouldn't occur due to his reputation and the reverence of the Central Plains people, but it did. As expected, Oh Qianmu, you were ultimately just a craftsman. Oh Qianmu's martial arts had reached a level that everyone could acknowledge. When one is said to be close to the best in the world in discussing swords, isn't that almost the highest praise? Certainly was. However, Yi, who had stayed here for a long time and experienced Master Oh Qianmu, believed he crucially lacked 2 things. One of those was lack of actual combat experience. It would be fair to say that Oh Qianmu had the least actual combat experience among those called the current top martial artists of the 6 heavens and 8 stars. The spiritual sword sanctuary was close to a neutral sect not belonging to the orthodox sects. The reason was that for a long time, they had focused more on activities as craftsmen rather than as martial artists. As a result, they had never particularly been hostile to or fought with other sects. At most, it was just martial arts competitions or sword discussions with the guests of the Sword Valley. Since their insights had increased by experiencing numerous secret techniques and sword techniques of many sword disciples accumulated since the previous generation, they couldn't help but be outstandingly strong in martial arts competitions or sword discussions. However, they had never actually fought a life-or-death battle even once. Nevertheless, the reason Master O came to be called one of the 6 heavens was because Yong Hyanmun, who was also one of the 6 heavens and the leader of the Righteous Alliance, had a sword discussion with Master O and acknowledged that he had reached the extreme of swordsmanship. Because of this, martial artists recognized him as one of the 6 heavens. But he actually lacks pride as a martial artist. Martial artists shouldn't just be good at theory. They trained in martial arts to protect themselves and fight others. Furthermore, martial artists were those who cut down enemies. However, Master Oh Qianmu, no, the O clan of the Spiritual Sword Sanctuary, had a clear sense of mission and pride as craftsmen, but lacked the will to fight someone. Without the will to fight, naturally there was no way they could have pride as martial artists. Master Oh, you're finally showing your limitations. Hui sighed and felt disappointed. He had vaguely sensed that he lacked the will to fight, but when placed in an extreme situation, it was revealed to be true. He was only half complete. Hui, shaking his head, shifted his gaze away from Master Oh Qianmu. The time he had spent here trying to break the way of the sword, extreme of the sword, wasn't wasted, but he no longer had interest in someone who had revealed his own limitations. No, there was no reason to be interested anymore. An opponent who could further draw out his will to fight had appeared. Swish. His gaze naturally turned to Mok Jiangun. Mok Jiangun glanced at the prostrated Master Oh Qianmu and his 2 sons, then snorted and said, "It seems the people behind you want you to fight me, Master." At this, Master Oh Qianmu raised his head and spoke. "My members and guests, please do not step forward anymore. This is a matter that this old man and the sir here must resolve." "Master, how can you say that? We are prepared to risk our lives." Silence. At his thunderous shout, the sword disciples and guests were startled into silence. When they quieted down, Master Oh Qianmu continued speaking without even giving them a glance. "That sword on the cliff is in a place even this old man cannot reach. How can you, who cannot even properly see that, risk your lives? Do not interfere any further." At his firm resolve, the sword disciples and guests closed their mouths. Not only was it difficult to step forward when the master spoke so decisively, but disappointment was evident in their eyes. They were gathered here solely out of respect for him. Although they might be lacking in skill, they had the will to fight, risking their lives if he led them. However, seeing him ultimately abandon his pride as a martial artist and choose humiliation and defeat for himself, their will was also broken. Ignoring them, Master Okianmu bowed his head again and said, "I will do as you know, as the noble sir wishes. Please show mercy." Ah! Mok Jung-un, who had been staring at him, thoroughly lowering himself, clicked his tongue. He had become interested when he saw him cut off his own arm and pushed him to see how he would respond this time, but it turned out differently from what he had wanted, so he lost interest. He belonged neither to the pride of a martial artist nor to paternal love for his child. "What do you intend to do now?" At that moment, Chong Ryong's voice rang in his ear. Mok Jung-un shrugged at this. "Well, I should end it moderately." "If you're going to end it moderately, why did you push so hard?" "Well, to eliminate future troubles, I needed to make sure. And even though I knew the difference in martial arts, I was curious how someone who had reached this level would react. Wasn't fighting that blade user enough? If I competed properly with one of the six heavens, I could gauge what level I'm at." "What?" Chong Ryong was exasperated. Only this mortal would try to gauge how far he had come by facing the six heavens, called the pinnacle of the current martial world. For this extremely cautious guy to act so boldly, he must have some confidence in his own strength. The time is ripe. Chong Ryong didn't show it, but she was gradually becoming excited. No matter how talented the mortal was, she had thought it would take at least 10 years to take revenge. However, this monster-like guy had shortened this to an unbelievable level. In just half a year he had reached a level equal to or surpassing the six heavens. It might be possible now. There was already a considerable force built up within the Heaven and Earth Society, and the subordinates gathered outside were no ordinary people either. Now the revenge she wanted might be possible. No, with this guy it would be possible. It's not far off. She couldn't hide her inner excitement. At that moment, Mok Jung-un withdrew the true energy that was about to tear out the second son Oh Woong-song's tongue. As he withdrew the true energy from his tongue, Oh Woong-song collapsed on the ground. "Ugh. Quickly stop the bleeding. He might die from blood loss." At these words, Junior Master Oh Woong-hwang rushed to the fallen Oh Woong-song, pressed his blood-stopping points, and hurriedly wrapped the severed part of his arm with cloth torn from his clothes. Watching Oh Woong-song barely saved from death, Master Oh Kyeon-moo unconsciously breathed a sigh of relief. No matter what, a child was still a child. Mok Jung-un said to him, "You said you could do anything, but how far can you go?" At these words, Master Oh Kyeon-moo's expression became subtle. He had felt extreme fear towards Mok Jung-un and had practically surrendered, but seeing him speak like this, he became afraid of what he might demand. This old man will do anything within his power. He drew a line, unable to accept demands like cutting off his arm. It meant to demand within limits he could accept. Within your power. Then it shouldn't be particularly difficult. If you want a sword to be crafted, I could make the finest sword befitting you. No. These swords are enough for me. Mok Jung-un casually tapped the two magic swords at his waist and said nonchalantly, "Then, let the Master and the Spiritual Sword Sanctuary swear loyalty to me." For a moment, everyone doubted their ears. Chapter 368, 7th Heaven 1. Then, let the Master and the Spiritual Sword Sanctuary swear loyalty to me. At Mok Jung-un's unexpected demand, Master Oh Kyeon-moo's expression twisted terribly, incomparable to before. Until now, no matter how surprised he had been, he had tried to maintain his composure as much as possible. However, this time it was difficult to maintain it. Although he had said with his own mouth that he would grant anything desired, he never expected a demand to swear loyalty. This person truly. Master. It cannot be. At Mok Jung-un's demand, the sword disciples of the Spiritual Sword Sanctuary and the guests rose up. No matter how disappointed they were with the master's submissive behavior, this was a completely different matter. Even if they didn't know his exact identity, everyone knew that person was a Fire Faith Order member. The Fire Faith Order was an organization suppressed by the country for the crime of deceiving the masses. Telling the Spiritual Sword Sanctuary to join such an organization was tantamount to telling them to turn against the country and the people of the Central Plains. "Master, this is not right. Joining the Fire Faith Order would ultimately... Whoosh. A guest who was shouting towards the master suddenly had to stop speaking, startled by a sword hilt that stopped an inch in front of his brow. Though stopped, the sword controlled by energy still carried an aura as if it would pierce his forehead at any moment, leaving the guest rolling his eyes, not knowing what to do. Then Mok Jiongun's voice reached his ears. You've been mistaken from the start, but who said I was a Fire Faith Order member? What? I can't say I have no connection with them, but I'm not a Fire Faith Order member. What do you mean? I'm just myself. Swish. As Mok Jiongun raised his hand, the remaining 7 swords floating in the air flew around in all directions like living things, showing a threatening appearance. Feeling wary, the sword disciples and guests took defensive stances. Swish. Swish. The speed at which the swords flew around was incredibly fast. Their eyes were tinged with tension. With 7 swords flying around independently, they couldn't help but think inwardly that he was a monster. Even controlling 1 or 2 swords would greatly divide one's attention, but moving this many swords simultaneously with the marvel of sword control with energy was beyond their level of comprehension. You keep telling the master he shouldn't do this or that, but why don't you step forward yourselves? No one opened their mouth at Mok Jiongun's provocative words. There weren't even any who rashly stepped forward. Although it looked like they were simply flying around on the surface, the 7 swords were intricately interlocked as if forming a battle formation trapping them. If they stepped forward carelessly, they might be the first to fall. Seeing them like this, Mok Jiongun sneered. Are you really the ones who said you could give your lives for the master? Don't you have the courage to fight unless the master steps forward first? Would such provocation go unchallenged? A middle-aged swordsman among the guests couldn't contain his anger and shouted, trying to launch himself towards Mok Jiongun. Who says we have no courage? I Bayong sword Wongsong will. Thud. Ugh. A sword controlled by energy pierced through his right shoulder. With a death cry, the swordsman who had identified himself as Wongsong fell forward, clutching his shoulder. Brother Wu. Another swordsman who was close to him tried to step forward. Then a sword brushed past his face. Hook. Thud. His severed left earlobe fell to the ground where the sword had passed. The swordsman, clutching his cut ear, froze as if turned to ice, unable to move from that spot. The same was true for the others. They thought they might suffer the same fate if they moved carelessly. Then someone shouted. We must move simultaneously. That's right. No matter how good his sword control with energy is, it's only 7 swords. How could he block us if we all move at once? Right at that moment, Mok Jiongun lightly waved his hand. Swish 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 swish. No way. It got even faster. Not only did the 7 swords fly around at a speed incomparable to before, but they also brushed past between them, threatening to cut them if they moved even a little. Just a moment ago they thought they had found a solution, but now they were at a loss, suppressed by the aura of the swords flying at tremendous speed. To them in their bewildered state, Mok Jiongun said, Shall we test how long it would take me to kill all of you? Flinch. At these words, everyone's expressions hardened. Master O Qianmu might be able to annihilate everyone here within a quarter hour if he put his mind to it. But if that monster whom even such a master had given up fighting, was determined to kill them, how long would it take? A quarter hour? No, half of that. Are you threatening us now? It's not a threat, I'm just telling you what's about to happen. What? As they were flustered, Mok Jiongun glanced at Master O Qianmu and said, If loyalty is burdensome, let's change the conditions, Master. What do you mean? Don't interfere with what happens from now on. Then I'll guarantee the lives of the Master and your sons. At these words from Mok Jiongun, the eyes of the sword disciples and guests trapped between the flying swords controlled by energy shook wildly. Until just a moment ago, the incident was a conflict with the Master's family. But suddenly the sparks had flown to them and in an instant, a knife was at their throats. Truly the human heart was unfathomably fickle. As the life-threatening sparks flew to them, their gazes without exception turned to the Master. Master O Qianmu sighed at their gazes. Their gazes seemed to say they would resent him if he didn't help them. He's not someone I can handle. O Qianmu inwardly clicked his tongue. This person was an expert at driving situations to extremes. If he had to watch their deaths helplessly because of the condition to grant any request, ultimately he and the spiritual sword sanctuary would have to bear all this resentment. Ah! How did he end up at odds with such a devil-like person? It was truly lamentable. Swish swish swish. Oh no. The swords. The trajectories of the flying swords controlled by energy began to narrow gradually. It really looked like he intended to kill them all. At this, Oh Qianmu shouted, "Do you really intend to kill them?" Mok Jiangun answered without stopping the swords controlled by energy. "I told you, didn't I? This is excessive. They were merely trying to help this old man. If they tried to help, isn't this level of readiness natural? It's called meddling when you interfere without the ability to handle it yourself. They're just paying the price for their meddling." At Mok Jiangun's firm words, Master Oh Qianmu finally had to make a choice. He bowed his head to the ground and shouted, "I swear loyalty to you, noble sir." His shout echoed loudly throughout the cliff-surrounded area. Father. Oh Wung Huang, the eldest son and junior master, couldn't hide his bitterness at his father's choice to finally swear loyalty. Although he had no choice as a son, it was unpleasant to see his father forcibly submit to someone. But how could spilled water be returned? He had to accept it. Swish. At that moment, Mok Jiangun made a gesture of lowering his hand. Then, clang, clang. The swords that had been flying through the air lost their power and fell to the ground. The sword disciples of the spiritual sword sanctuary and the guests, freed from the threat of the swords controlled by energy, were relieved but didn't know what to do out of guilt as they looked at the master. It was because Master Oh Qianmu had finally sworn loyalty to save them. They couldn't help but feel sorry for this. Swish. A strange light flickered in Master Oh Qianmu's eyes as he raised his head to check if Mok Jiangun had stopped threatening them. It was because of the gazes of those looking at him. Just a moment ago they had seemed to not understand his choice. But now it was the opposite. Don't tell me he intended even this? Oh Qianmu looked at Mok Jiangun. Seeing him smile slightly as he looked at himself, Oh Qianmu felt goosebumps all over his body. What on earth was this person? He had thought he had simply driven the situation to extremes and ultimately obtained what he wanted. But it wasn't just that. Did he create justification? The sword disciples and guests, perhaps because they thought they had been saved by his oath of loyalty, showed no disappointment or dissatisfaction with this choice. It was as if they thought this choice was natural and unavoidable. This might be his true terror. The ability to move even the hearts of others at will was a frightening power. Just like Master Oh Qianmu, who was deeply afraid of Mok Jiangun even after swearing loyalty, there was another person who viewed this situation seriously. She was Zhang Maiyong Sate of the Hangshan sect, dispatched as an investigator from the Righteous Alliance. For Master O to swear loyalty to someone? This was not something that could be simply overlooked. Master O Qianmu was one of the six heavens, called the pinnacle of the current martial world. Even if he had lost his will to fight due to lack of real combat experience and acknowledged defeat, he was still a peerless expert of the Grand Master level who had surpassed wall after wall. Moreover, as Master Oh Qianmu was a craftsman and sword disciple respected by all swordsmen of the Central Plains, he had tremendous influence. This is serious. That person possessed martial arts worthy of being called a new seventh heaven. For such a person to take Master Oh Qianmu under his wing would disrupt the balance of power that had been maintained until now. I must quickly inform the Alliance headquarters. This was an issue that warranted convening the entire Council of Elders of the Righteous Alliance. Although he declared he wasn't a Fire Faith Order member, judging from his reckless actions he was definitely not an Orthodox sect member. If he was from an evil sect, this incident could be considered an even worse outcome than the annihilation of the Namgung family's leader and their elites. But how can I find out who he is? It would be troublesome if she carelessly stepped forward and became at odds with him. As she was pondering this, coincidentally, Master Oh Qianmu asked Mok Jiangun, "Although I have sworn loyalty, I still don't know your esteemed name. How should this lowly one address you?" To this question Mok Jiangun answered briefly, "Qianma. Call me Qianma, Heaven Demon." At these words, Zhang Maiyong Sate's eyes widened. On her way here she had heard one strange rumor. It was a story that the 108 Arhat formation of Shaolin, called the birthplace of the Orthodox sect's martial arts, had been broken by a single true enlightened one step. As it was such an absurd story, she had dismissed it as mere gossip. But she remembered exactly what they had called it. Heaven Demon's Sovereign Step. They had definitely said that. Chapter 369, Seventh Heaven 2. Sizzle. Although gripped by pain that felt like burning every time Mok Jae-un's sword intent touched him, Master Oh Kyeonmu didn't show any signs of pain or utter even a single groan. Phew. He merely regulated his breathing. Of course, it was partly due to his strong endurance, but it was also because of his dignity. As one called one of the six heavens, the pinnacle of the current martial world, it was difficult to show weakness in front of his children. Watching him, the second son Oh Woong-song inwardly clicked his tongue. He whose arm had been reattached first, couldn't endure the pain and had screamed. Yet seeing his father's expression not changing at all, he felt both admiration and even more guilt. If I hadn't coveted that orb, would this have happened? Yes. Maybe it wouldn't have. That's why he felt even more guilty. What pained him even more was that neither his father nor his brothers blamed him. Even that youngest brother Oh Yinwo, born of a different mother, whom he had resented and tormented so much. That boy had bowed his head for his sake. Even his elder brother, who had been practically backstabbed by him. Drip. A tear rolled down the cheek of the second son Oh Woong-song, whose eyes had reddened. He wasn't aware of it, but Mok Jae-un was closely observing this. Although he had ended it after receiving loyalty from Master Oh Kyeonmu and the Spiritual Sword Sanctuary, he had been considering killing him if necessary because he had continued to create troublesome situations. But seeing his gaze and attitude change so noticeably, he felt puzzled. That is what it means to be human. Chong Ryong's voice rang in Mok Jae-un's ear. To this, Mok Jae-un replied through voice transmission. What do you mean by that? What do you think distinguishes humans from beasts? Isn't it the use of tools and the ability to think? He answered with the most decisive differences. Chong Ryong inwardly clicked her tongue and said, Of course there's that. But humans also change. Change, you say? Yes. Mortal, you seem to think humans are inherently unchanging because you don't trust anyone, but human beings change as they experience many things. For example, the emotion of regret would be part of that. Regret? Isn't that also a kind of learning? Don't view all emotions simply rationally. Emotions belong to the realm of sensibility. If Chong Ryong says so, then it must be. Mok Jae-un answered with a slight smile. Seeing him like this, Chong Ryong muttered softly. And you're changing too. Pardon? It's nothing. You clearly said something. I said it's nothing. At her firm exclamation, Mok Jae-un shrugged. No matter how much she muttered, there was no way he couldn't have heard the words ringing in his ear. Changing, she says. He didn't know in what aspect she was saying such things. He felt he was still the same as ever. Sizzle. Having successfully completed the three marvels method, Mok Jae-un removed his hand from the wound on Master Oh Kyeonmu's severed right arm. Try moving it. At these words from Mok Jae-un, Master Oh Kyeonmu carefully tried moving his arm. Swish. Ah. Oh Kyeonmu's eyes trembled. He had only moved it a little, but sensation returned to the arm that had been filled with emptiness just moments ago. It was truly remarkable. Although it was no longer surprising after seeing the second son Oh Woong-song's arm reattached, he couldn't help feeling overwhelmed as his arm moved. At this, Master Oh Kyeonmu knelt on one knee before Mok Jae-un, clasped his hands and said respectfully, This old one offers thanks for the noble sir's generous grace. Thud. We brothers also thank you. Following him, the eldest son Junior Master Oh Woong-hwang, the second son Oh Woong-song and the third son the youngest Oh Yinwo, also knelt on one knee and showed respect. Regardless of how it happened, they were simply grateful just for reattaching their father's and brother's severed arms. Mok Jae-un waved his hand lightly at them as if bothered and said, This much is only natural. I understand, so would you all please rise? Rip. Clang. At that moment, a leather scabbard tore an evil commandment sword, one of Mok Jae-un's magic swords, fell to the ground. It seemed that although it was made to serve as a scabbard, it couldn't withstand evil commandment sword's sharpness and finally tore. Then Master Oh Kyeonmu, noticing this, opened his mouth with surprised eyes. Noble sir, is that perhaps the evil commandment sword? As expected of a sword craftsman, you recognize it at a glance. There have been people who sensed the sword's demonic nature, but you're the first to immediately recognize what sword it is, sect leader. Indeed, it was rare for someone to recognize what sword it was at a glance without extensive knowledge about swords. In that sense, he couldn't help but feel puzzled that he recognized the sword's name instantly. But then, how could I not know? That sword was made by our clan's ancestor Oyezi. How could this descendant not recognize it? Oyezi, a man from the state of Yu during the spring and autumn period, considered the greatest craftsman. The swords he made were all renowned and called legendary swords that transcended time. A strange light flickered in Mok Jiongun's eyes. He had heard that he was called a sword craftsman to the extent that there were rumors of him being a descendant of Oyezi, but it wasn't a rumor, it was none other than the truth. A forest about 30 ri away from the spiritual sword sanctuary. There, a group of warriors with visible signs of fatigue were panting and catching their breath. The clothing of these people bore the emblem symbolizing the righteous alliance. Hugh. Among these exhausted people, there was one who was slowly regulating his breathing, though not as tired as the others. It was Moyong Hak, the eldest son of the Moyong family. What could be the reason that even he, leading the righteous alliance warriors, was so exhausted? Moyong Hak raised his head and looked up at the trees. Why on earth is she doing this? In fact, he too didn't know the reason. Just because of her one word that they needed to hurry, they had to use their lightness skill without rest as soon as they left the spiritual sword sanctuary. Thanks to this, even he, with relatively solid internal energy, couldn't help but be exhausted. Meanwhile, someone landed in front of him. Thud. It was none other than Zhang Myong Sate of the Hangshan sect. She, who had descended with graceful body techniques, breathed a sigh of relief and said, Amit Ba. Fortunately, it seems there is no pursuit. At these words, Moyong Hak asked in a tone of incomprehension, Pursuit? What do you mean by that, Sade? Don't tell me you did this because you thought that monster-like person might have set trackers on us. That's correct. What? He had thought it unlikely, but was it really because of that they had used their lightness skill recklessly as soon as they left the spiritual sword sanctuary? But didn't that person say with his own mouth? Righteous Alliance? I think I've heard of it. They say it's one of the 3 powers dividing the current martial world along with the Heaven and Earth Society and the 4 Evils Alliance. Amit Ba. That's correct. From the look in your eyes you seem quite worried, monk. Not at all, patron. How could this humble monk do such a thing? Rather, I'm grateful that you've resolved the true culprit behind the Namgung family tragedy, which was a concern for our alliance. I didn't particularly do it for the Righteous Alliance, but if it helped you, then I suppose there's no need for us to be at odds with each other. Zhang Myong-sa also remembered the last words that person had said. He hadn't exactly spoken in a roundabout way. It clearly meant that they shouldn't create reasons to be at odds with each other. From their standpoint, they didn't particularly want to make him an enemy, so if the other party took the initiative like this, it wasn't bad. Moyong Hak had taken this at face value. He thought that the other party wouldn't want to be at odds with a huge organization like the Righteous Alliance either. But Zhang Myong-sate didn't take it so literally. Patron. Does, let's not create reasons to be at odds sound purely friendly to you? Are you saying it has a different meaning? To this humble monk's ears, it sounded like he could handle it even if reasons to be at odds arose. What? I didn't say this at the scene because there were many ears listening and eyes watching. But this isn't something our alliance, no, the current martial world can simply overlook. Is it because a new peerless expert has appeared? It's not just a new expert. As you must have realized too, Patron Moyong, he will soon be called the 7th Heaven by martial artists. At these words, Moyong Hak couldn't hide his excitement. The 7th Heaven? You mean he'll become one of the 7 heavens? It's not about becoming one. When this incident spreads, he will establish himself as a new heaven. He broke the 108 Arhat formation of Shaolin, called the birthplace of the orthodox sect's martial arts, with just one true enlightened step, and Master O Qianmu of the Spiritual Sword Sanctuary, one of the current martial world's 6 pinnacles, acknowledged defeat without even fighting, swearing loyalty after seeing the sword mark on the cliff. With just these 2 actions he was already writing a legend surpassing the other 6 heavens. What she was worried about wasn't the emergence of this new powerhouse. An expert who has reached the realm of Grandmaster has entered under someone stronger than him. Just that alone is already distorting the balance of power. Ah! At her meaningful words, Moyong Hak finally realized the seriousness of the situation. The problem was that the new powerhouse didn't just defeat an existing powerhouse, but subjugated him. An expert at the level of the six heavens was no different from a one-man sect by himself. Just by taking such a being under his wing, this person had essentially shattered the balance in the current martial world and created a new landscape. The fact that he subjugated Master O and took him under his wing, when he could have ended it with just a competition, means his actions might not end with simply making a name for himself. So that's why you were worried about pursuit. Yes, he might want to delay the spread of news about his actions. Saute. What is it? Thinking about it, isn't this even more serious? What do you mean? Doesn't the fact that he just let us, members of the Righteous Alliance, go mean that he doesn't care even if his actions become known? At these words from Moyong Hak, Zhang Myong Saute's expression became even more serious. This made sense. The opponent might be so confident that he doesn't even care if his actions are revealed to the Righteous Alliance's ears, or he might be ready to create a new order. To this, Zhang Myong Saute said, "This won't do. Patron, we need to hurry to a branch office to send a messenger bird, and then we should go straight to the Alliance's headquarters." This place, full of the smell of iron and still filled with heat, was Master O Qianmu's workshop. Many famous swords that made a name in the current martial world were born here. Among them, the sword that many swordsmen considered the best was Ilwi, the unique weapon of Zhang Haiyanmun, the leader of the Righteous Alliance. Zhang Haiyanmun, one of the six heavens, was known to have never been defeated since obtaining Ioi, and O Qianmu's reputation as a craftsman soared to the heavens after that. Many people considered it a great wish to enter this place and ask O Qianmu to craft their unique weapon. Tap. Master O Qianmu, who had been examining the torn leather scabbard, put it down and said, "A leather scabbard will have difficulty withstanding the sword's sharpness." To these words, Mok Jiangun shrugged and replied, "Yes, it was a bit precarious." He had somewhat expected this as he always carried the sword. Master O Qianmu politely extended both hands. "I need to craft a scabbard suitable for the sword. May this lowly one examine the sword for a moment? Will you be all right?" "What do you mean?" "Evil Commandment sword is set to reveal its desires when touched by anyone other than me." So it's as I've heard." Master O Qianmu nodded and stared intently at the magic sword Evil Commandment sword. But that gaze was strangely bitter. It's a sword made by O Yezi, who could be considered his ancestor, so why is he looking at it with such eyes? What's wrong? Is there something wrong with the sword? Mok Jiangun lifted the sword to examine it. What was surprising was that despite being so old and having absorbed much blood, the blade of the magic sword Evil Commandment sword was still sharp and without a single blemish. Even excellent iron would inevitably have its edge damaged after long use and clashing, so this was truly strange. Then O Qianmu brought thick work gloves and said, "That sword is made of a very special iron called Guanya Black Iron, so its blade probably won't be damaged until its lifespan is completely over." O Qianmu put on the gloves and extended both hands again. At this, Mok Jiangun handed him the sword. If necessary, he could subdue him and take it back, and inwardly he was also curious about what would happen if a peerless expert at the Grand Master level like him held Evil Commandment sword. Tap. O Qianmu received the sword while wearing gloves. The sword body trembled subtly. Although it wasn't in direct contact because of the gloves, it might be showing aversion to being in someone else's hands. But then as O Qianmu injected true energy into the sword, woong woong woong, the sword's cry rang out and the trembling of the sword body stopped. Did he subdue it? A strange light flickered in Mok Jiangun's eyes. Indeed, perhaps because he had achieved the way of the sword, extreme of the sword, he seemed to be at a level where he could control even Evil Commandment sword's demonic nature. It wasn't for nothing that he was called one of the six heavens. Having suppressed the sword's spirit with his true energy, O Qianmu spoke in a bitter voice. "A sword can be illuminated by itself, but truly the element of a great sword is that it can make its owner shine the brightest. However, this sword has a nature completely opposite to that. To think there's a sword that drives its owner to the brink of death unless they can overcome its demonic nature." O Qianmu shook his head. Then, scanning the sword body with both eyes, he continued speaking. "Our ancestor O Yezi said that making this and 4 other demonic swords was the most regrettable thing he did in his lifetime. 5 demonic swords. He said making them was shameful. Were there demonic swords other than Evil Commandment Sword and Plundering Killing Sword? More than that, it was unexpected to hear that he expressed shame after making the swords. This was because Mok Jeongun quite liked Evil Commandment Sword and Plundering Killing Sword. Is it because they became demonic swords? That might be part of the reason, but the reason our ancestor regretted making these demonic swords lies elsewhere. What is it? To Mok Jeongun's question, Master O Kyeonmu answered in a meaningful voice. It's because human flesh and blood and their grudges are imbued in these demonic swords. Is that so? For a moment, Master O Kyeonmu frowned. Is this really all the reaction he has?